Today on the Lachuga Book Club, we're talking Project Hail Mary, Frank Miller's run on Daredevil, and most importantly, Good Omens by Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman. This book was really disappointing for me, if I'm being honest. Which is kind of sad to say, because there is actually a lot I like about the book. The first 100 pages or so are rather entertaining. You have this really fun dynamic between these two main characters, Crowley and Aziraphale. No idea how you pronounce the name. My knowledge of the Bible, I only know from Persona, okay? I know fuck all. These two are just funny. They have good chemistry, they work really well off each other. They take an already funny plot on a conceptual level and they elevate it to something a lot better than it is. Which, I mean, the plot is already rather interesting. Basically, it's guys, we've lost the Antichrist. You gotta find him. That in and of itself is quite funny. I'd say the first act worked rather well. There's a lot of really funny, quippy one-liners. There's a lot of long monologues similar to what I've read in other Gaiman books, but in here it's a lot funnier. Especially with some of the footnotes they leave at the end of some of these chapters, this is not actually true. The road to hell is paved with frozen door-to-door salesmen. On weekends, many of the younger demons go ice skating down it. I will say though, these narrations don't always work for me. There are some that didn't really quite scratch that itch. In every big budget science fiction movie, there's a moment when a spaceship as large as New York suddenly goes to light speed. A twanging noise like a wooden ruler being plucked over the edge of a desk, a dazzling refraction of light, and suddenly the stars have all been stretched out thin and it's gone. This was exactly like that, except that instead of a gleaming 12-mile long spaceship, it was an off-white 20-year-old motor scooter. I see why some people could like them. For me personally, it just didn't really click. I don't really know why. Probably because it's just so random. I like it when it's quirky, but it's when it gets too out there for me, it just doesn't really work. But that's honestly not that big of a deal. My main problem with the book is the way it's not structured, the way it's paced. The pacing is so off. There are so many jokes in this book. Very funny jokes, but too many jokes. It kind of gets ridiculous at a certain point. It often feels like Gaiman and Pratchett are more interested in trying to come up with whatever the funniest situation for the characters to be in is, instead of trying to craft the best story. And that really affected my enjoyment of the book, because I was not invested in anything that was happening. Not only because there's so many jokes, but also because the book is constantly changing between 4 different perspectives. We follow the Antichrist himself in his own little kiddish adventures. That was kind of lame. We follow this guy Newt and this girl Anathema as they try to decipher this ancient book of prophecies that is impossible to understand. That part was actually quite funny, if a bit of a pace killer. And we also follow this old man, I forgot his name right now, and who's basically part of the same organization as Newt. It doesn't matter. It all is pointless by the end of the book. Without spoiling things, this book resorts to one of the biggest cop-outs I've seen or read in a book in a long time. It is the epitome of Deus Ex Machina. It's such an absurd slap in the face for everything you've read so far to be resolved in the way it does. Which is a shame, considering that, at least in the case of Gaiman and the other books I've read of his, you don't have the structural problem. It doesn't never really feels like he has to resort to Deus Ex Machina to just solve the plot. I don't think this is a particularly bad book. I just think that it didn't really work for me. I'm usually all for comedy, but there's just too much of it. There comes a point where I'm just okay, why don't I just watch a stand-up routine if I just want to hear a bunch of jokes? There's a book called Is This Anything by Jerry Seinfeld, and it was just literally just a bunch of stand-up routines. Yeah, might as well just read that. Just give me a series of punchlines, Because the story here didn't really, it just doesn't work very well. The characters aren't there. I can see why some people like it. It's just not for me. I will give Good Omens 2.5 Antichrists out of 5. Hopefully I don't get crucified for that. Now, if you haven't noticed already, I'm mostly talking out of my ass here, so don't take everything I say too seriously. These book club videos are meant to be just discussion more than anything else. But with that said, if you are a fan of sci-fi and have not read this next book, you gotta get on this shit ASAP, cause it will blow your goddamn balls off. I'm talking about Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir, who you might recognize as the same guy who wrote The Martian, another incredible book. In all honesty, this book was just incredible. It's really hard to talk about this book without spoilers. The basic blurb is this. This guy, Grace, wakes up, 2 dead bodies next to him. He's in an alien spaceship. What is happening? Holy shit. He suffers from amnesia and has no idea what is happening. I know this sounds like generic as fuck, but it isn't. You just gotta trust me on this one. From the moment I started the audiobook of this one, I knew I was gonna like it because Andy Weir dedicates his novel to John, Paul, George, and Ringo. Now, when I heard this, for a moment I thought that maybe John and Paul were like his nephews or whatever, but then when he said the whole cast and names, I was like, did bro just dedicate his book to the goddamn Beatles? That's fucking hilarious. I will admit that the initial mystery of the book put me off a little bit of it just cause it's so generic. Cause at least from an outsider's perspective looking in, you don't know anything about Andy Weir, you don't know anything about Project Hail Mary, you get to this point where amnesia, dead bodies, it's hard to grasp on anything. You read The Martian and you very quickly understand what it's about. Guy stranded in Mars, gotta get back to Earth. Pretty straightforward, all things considered. But actually, I'd say this mystery aspect of the book might be its strongest quality. The slow reveal of everything that happened to lead up until this point where Grace is in the middle of space not knowing why. It's so perfectly paced and so compelling. It just feels like Andy Weir knows when to show you the current day stuff and when to go back and show you all the backstory. Kind of the opposite of Good Omens now that I think about it. The two perspectives here really complement each other. It helps keep the story fresh at every turn. This book also has 2 things that I think are key in Andy Weir's writing that makes it so compelling for me to read. First of all, first-person narration. First person is just such a great way of having a very definitive narrative voice in your book that has a lot of personality to it and is easy to grow attached to. I loved Mark Watney in The Martian, and Dr. Grace here is also just a really lovable character who you love rooting for. The second thing I love about Weir's writing is the actual science part of science fiction. Just like in his previous books, you can tell that this guy put an insane amount of research into these books. There are these long narrations describing scientific experiments ranging from cosmology to evolution that, in all honesty, my English major ass didn't really understand most of it. But it sounds right, you know? But it never borders on exposition. It's always so entertaining, so fun to read, because it always adds to the plot in a very obvious and direct way. It was a blast to listen in the audiobook, honestly. The only thing I'm gonna complain about, that's not so much a complaint as it is something that I think could have been done better, is the ending. No spoilers, since I think this is really something you should read for yourself. It really is a fun sci-fi novel, but the ending feels rushed. The third act is just building and building and building, and it feels like by the end of the book it's gonna crescendo into an extremely satisfying climax. But then it just kind of stops. It's not a bad ending, it's a satisfying ending, all things considered, but it just leaves a few unanswered questions and unsatisfying moments. I feel like the book could have easily gone on for another 3 or 4 chapters, and keep in mind these are relatively long chapters that this book has. The ending still works, it's a good ending, but just the fact that it feels like there's so much more that could be into it. Even now, the more I think about it, the more I realize there are just some things oh, what happened to this guy? What happened to this character? What happened here? It's a decent ending, like it works. I just think it could have been done better. Overall, if you enjoy sci-fi, this is a must-read alongside The Martian. I will give Project Hail Mary one entire The Beatles out of 5. Highly recommend if you like sci-fi. Lastly, we're talking this book club's comic book. I don't know if you can see it there. It's Daredevil. Like it's a classic. Frank Miller's run on Daredevil. If you haven't heard of Frank Miller, he's like a comic book legend. He did what is often considered one of the greatest comic books of all time, Dark Knight Returns. He also did a bunch of other great Batman comics like Year One. Moreover, he wrote what might be the most definitive Daredevil comic books of all time. These comic books are not only still massively influential for the character, but for other comics and how Daredevil is portrayed in other medium other than comics. Like the Daredevil TV show is heavily based on this. The Ben Affleck movie is probably based on this one. The upcoming TV show Daredevil Born Again is named after one of his Daredevil comics. This guy's a big deal. So what I read was mainly this, which is a retelling of Daredevil's origin story. It's the only one I have physically. I also read the 24-issue main run on the comic, plus the 8-issue arc Born Again, which is like the biggest deal in the world in Daredevil. So what do I have to say about this comic other than it's incredible? I mean, just Man Without Fear is probably one of the best superhero origin stories I've ever read. It really like ticks all the boxes. Great characters, great story, great art. It does such a perfect job of taking the original Silver Age comic book origin story and turning it into something so much darker and grittier and grounded that really sticks with you. It encompasses the 90s edge perfectly. But for me though, the highlight is the actual comic run. I've been reading a lot of stuff from the 80s lately, and this comic book kind of encompasses everything I love about this decade. Miller not only knows how to tell a good episodic narrative, but also have each episodic issue, add to like a wider story. So for example, in the very first Frank Miller issue, you get the introduction of Elektra, which is going to be a big deal, and then Bullseye comes into play, and then the Kingpin. He does a great job at establishing the major players of the comic book early on, and really having them make an impression on you. Like Elektra, oh what a fun, interesting character, Matt Murdock's girlfriend from college. She's a mercenary, she works on her own terms. It's an entertaining character. And Bullseye, holy shit, Bullseye. I read a few of the issues before this one to kind of get an idea of what I was getting into, and I kind of got the impression that Bullseye was just like another villain of the week. But like Frank Miller takes this like lame villain of the week character and turns him into a fucking menace. This guy is ruthless. In the issue that Frank Miller writes where he first shows up, like, Bullseye just straight up murders a fuck ton of people and then has this really cool fight with Daredevil in a subway. It's so awesome. And then you get the Kingpin. The Kingpin, it's kind of the same deal. Like, I mean, I remember when I was reading the Spider-Man comics and Spider-Man No More, and I quite liked the Kingpin, but he wasn't like a big standout on all those villains or anything. But here, Miller takes the character and turns him again into this big, ruthless monster that you just love to hate. Not only are all the characters great, but it feels again like the story is building up to something. You have no idea how many comic books I read where I'm like 20 issues in and I just feel like we're meandering. It's like, okay, come on, where is the story headed? What is the point of any of this? Daredevil, like Miller's Daredevil, not only like promises and builds things, but it also delivers on them. I'd say the issue that really blew me away was 181. What a fantastic issue. You have this big confrontation between Elektra and Bullseye. Some big dramatic moments happen. There was one moment, no spoilers, there was one moment that actually left me like jaw dropping. It was like, whoa my god, I cannot believe like Marvel had the balls to greenlight something like this. It is quite impressive. This all leads to the natural conclusion that is Daredevil Born Again. And god damn it, is it as good as people say it is. Here we see Daredevil at pretty much the lowest point he'll ever be in. And Seeing him like this is not only super compelling, but the way it's executed and the stories each of the issues tell perfectly encapsulate everything that Miller has worked on in the comic up until this point. It's so dark and morbid. For a moment I thought they weren't gonna stick the landing, because it's like, how do you conclude all of this in just a few issues left? But somehow Miller pulls through and delivers something that's honestly quite great. If you like the Daredevil TV show or just comic books in general, this is a must read. I will give Frank Miller's Daredevil 5 stars out of 5. That's how you know I'm serious about this one. But hey, at the end of the day, this is the Lechuga Book Club. We're all part of the conversation here, so let me know in the comments. Have you read any other books here? Do you agree with my takes? Have you read any other books lately? I love to hear from you, and I'll be down there in those comments keeping the conversation going. Subscribe for more book clubs, and I'll see you next video.